whole day through, and half the summer's night. Donner, 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 donner. Stop complaining, said the farmer, who told you a calf to be. Why don't you have wings to fly with, like the swallow so proud and free? How the winds are laughing, they laugh with all their might. Laugh and laugh the whole day through, and half the summer's night, singing softly, donner, 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 donner. Calves are easily bound and slaughtered, never knowing the reason why. But whoever treasures freedom, like the swallow, has learned to fly. How the winds are laughing, they laugh with all their might. Laugh and laugh the whole day through, and half the summer's night, singing softly, donner, 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 donner. On a wagon bound for market, there's a calf with a mournful eye. High above him there's a swallow, winging softly through the sky. How the winds are laughing, they laugh with all their might. Laugh and laugh the whole day through, and half the summer's night. Donner, 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 donner. Stop complaining, said the farmer, who told you a calf to be. Why don't you have wings to fly with, like the swallow so proud and free? How the winds are laughing, they laugh love with all their might. Laugh and laugh the whole day through, and half the summer's night, singing softly, Donna, 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 Donna. Calves are easily bound and slaughtered, never knowing the reason why. But whoever treasures freedom, like the swallow has learned to fly. How the winds are laughing, they laugh with all their might. Laugh and laugh the whole day through, and half the summer's night, singing softly, Donna, 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 Donna.
On behalf of the Greater Manchester Combined Authority and our 10 Greater Manchester councils, I would like to thank you all for joining us for today's Holocaust Memorial Day service. As well as commemorating the Holocaust, today is a day to mark and remember all of those people around the world who were killed, who survived, or who were impacted by genocide. We think, of course, of Cambodia, Rwanda, Darfur, Bosnia, and the ongoing persecution of Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar. At today's event, we have the genuine privilege of listening to Holocaust survivor Tommy Komoli. We will also hear from Rwandan survivor Rema Muguyeneza. I urge you all to listen carefully to their powerful stories. The theme for this year's Holocaust Memorial Day 2021 is Be the Light in the Darkness. It is a reminder that even in these difficult and dark times, we can all be the light in our own way. We can do this in different ways, from acts of solidarity and support for each other, illuminating mistruths, and always challenging hate, prejudice, and discrimination wherever we find it. We always hear people say we must never forget the atrocities of the Holocaust, but we need to do more than never forget. Now more than ever, we must stand together with each other in our communities and resolve to prevent division, tackle hate, and stop the spread of identity-based hostility. This solemn event and our reflection on those atrocities of 75 or more years ago is a reminder of our collective duty to challenge hatred or face the consequences of our collective silence, because to turn the other way makes us complicit. By coming together today to mark this Holocaust Memorial Day, we send the loudest possible message that Greater Manchester rejects hate in all of its forms. Greater Manchester is a welcoming and diverse city region, and we're proud of that. A place where we celebrate our differences, and everybody should feel safe to be themselves. We are stronger together, and we will never let hate divide us. So let's all light the way with strength, kindness, and compassion, and let us all be the light in the darkness. And before I hand over to Rabbi Walker, I would like to thank all of the speakers for joining us today, and the Association of Jewish Refugees, who again have provided invaluable support.
The sheer scale of the horror of the Holocaust can make it very hard to relate to. And so I, like many others, choose to focus on the representative memories of individuals, perhaps individuals that we know. I am particularly honored and privileged to have in my synagogue community a very, very special man, a man who many of you perhaps met last year when he addressed this event. A man by the name of Mr. Isaac Altman, member of my community, known to his friends as his experiences in the Holocaust. And so before Holocaust Memorial Day, I chose once again to read through his words. And as every time I read his words, I was once again struck by the depths of the horror, but also by the depths of the strength in those words. One particular thing struck me this year in my reading this time. In January 1945, Isaac was in Auschwitz-Birkenau. He was there as the Russian army approached, but he wasn't liberated on January 27th, because 2 days before, he was marched on what is now known as the Death March, an event so horrific that it's indescribable even in context of the rest of the Holocaust. He was forced with many others to march away from the liberating armies into further suffering and servitude. He arrived at the end of January in Buchenwald. Buchenwald, of course, was also liberated, but again, Isaac wasn't there when Buchenwald was freed, because a day before, he'd been marched out again to trek and to suffer and to leave behind his potential liberators. Isaac went through another almost liberation. He went through another terrible suffering when the Nazis deliberately fed them soup which had been oversalted and then refused to give them water, just to make sure that a few more people would die horribly. He eventually arrived in April in Theresienstadt, and there finally he was liberated, 3 months after he could have been the first time. What strikes me is not just the terrible evil and depravity of his Nazi captors, but also their persistence in that evil. They were utterly devoted to the cause of causing as much suffering and death as possible. They were utterly committed to their goal of making this world a much worse place. They wouldn't let up in their attempts to end one more life, one more Jewish life, until they were literally forced to stop by the advancing liberation armies. Today we remember, we commemorate, we pay our respects, but that is an active memory. We do so that we can resolve to make a difference. And as the theme of this year's Holocaust Memorial Day emphasizes, we do that by being a light unto the world, by being a light in the darkness, by making the world a better place. Lights are amazing things. They are very small sometimes, but when they join up with other sources of light, they can push away much darkness. In order to make this world a better place, in order to bring healing in the place of suffering, we also need to be committed. We also need to be devoted, but not to evil, God forbid, but to good. Good people need to be persistent and continuous in their performance of kindness, in their alleviating suffering, and then they're making sure that further suffering and evil is never perpetuated in this world today. So today I ask you to commit, not just to do one good thing, but to do continuous good things, until together we can make this world into a place worth living in, a place filled with goodness and the presence of God.
Before I start telling you about what happened to me during the Holocaust. Let me just say a very few words about myself. I was born in Budapest in Hungary in 1936, and my father came from a Zionist Hungarian family. We weren't particularly religious. I was going to a Jewish school for about a year and a half before things got really bad. And I will tell you the actual story in a second. But maybe just underlying the facts that are to come. I myself was lucky enough not to end up in a concentration camp, but the events were really the after effect of the events carried on with me, mostly in the way that for decades I would not even admit to anybody that I was Jewish, and that carried on in Hungary. When I was 20, there was an uprising against the then communist regime in Hungary, which created such an upheaval that about 200,000 people left the country, and I was one of those. I was lucky enough to be given a scholarship, and I came and studied in Britain, where I qualified as an engineer and set up set up my family. I married an English girl from Leeds, and that's really what brought me to the present moment. But to get back to my story, let me say a few words about Hungary. Hungary had a very long history of anti-Semitism through the centuries, and that kind of made itself felt as the Second World War unfolded. Germany attacked Poland and Slovakia, and a lot of Jewish people who had seen what was going on in Germany decided to escape from there, and they came to Hungary in very large numbers. And altogether, with the refugees, the Hungarian Jewish community grew to about 1 million people. And by this time, the Hungarian government decided to join the Germans in the war effort, and they're also following the German example. And very soon they brought in some anti-Jewish laws, and in 1939 they restricted Jews in various professions, civil service and all the rest of it. And by 1942 there was a total exclusion, mostly aimed at the fact that Jewish people have always laid a great emphasis on education, and as a result of that, in many of the professions, arts, even in some parts of government and civil service, they reached a very, very significant proportion of those places, and that obviously generated quite a lot of jealousy. And when these restrictions came into being, my father, who ran a very small business, scrap metal business, he was forced to sell it to his foreman, and he became one of some 200,000 who became jobless in effect, and he had to learn a new trade. He started making small ceramics just to give us a living. As the war went on, particularly in the Eastern Front, the Germans were suffering significant losses, and they asked the Hungarian government to send people to the front. And when it came to the Jews, the Hungarians were not willing to give them arms. So they created what they called forced labor units. And my father was one of those people who got called up. And when I was about 7, he left home. And with this single exception later on that I will tell you, that was about the last time that I saw him. The Hungarian government, as the war unfolded further, were afraid that they would end up on the losing side, and tried to contact the British to come to a separate treaty to change sides, in fact. And when Hitler found out about this, he sent the German troops into Hungary, and with it came a small contingent of the Gestapo to introduce all the severe activities and constraints at this point, which they had practiced in other countries. This was in March of 1944, and the first serious anti-Jewish law that came into being was that all of us from age 6 upwards had to wear a yellow star on our outer garments. And what I personally remember from this is that as more and more such laws came into being, the government used placards on the streets to bring it to the notice of everybody what decisions they were making. And the word Jew, which is Žido in Hungarian, kept popping up left, right, and center. And I really had this kind of oppressive feeling that everybody was pointing fingers at me, and that really was a contributing factor to my being actually ashamed of being Jewish. After the Yellow Star, the government also constrained the use of public transport. They confiscated a lot of Jewish property, most importantly, radios and telephones, because they wanted to make sure that we were out of communication. And they also introduced rationing. That was for everybody, but for Jewish people, these rations were much smaller than for anybody else. And of course, that affected our everyday living in a particular way. And following again the fascist tactics in Poland and other countries, they decided to deport as much of the Hungarian Jewish population, particularly to Auschwitz, as they could. And they started in the provinces, and it started in April, and by the end of June, something like 500,000 to 600,000 provincial Jews had been put into cattle wagons. And you can imagine the conditions as they suffered for 2 or 3 days on the way to the camps. And quite a lot of people who hear about the Holocaust come across the figure of 6 million being deported overall. What they don't realize is that out of that 6 million, 1.5 million were children. And they had to suffer exactly the same conditions and all the deprivations as the adults, and they probably suffered even more because they didn't understand what was going on. For that matter, even the adults have been misled into believing that they were just being taken to work camps and the like, because I mentioned before, through education, they had filled all these important positions in the country's life. And they really couldn't believe that all that will be overlooked. And they went almost willingly, and they didn't put up any resistance. They couldn't contemplate the danger that was facing them, because even when they received news from various quarters. Going on to June 1944, the government decided that in Budapest, where the remaining Jewish population was, they wanted to concentrate the population, and they nominated about 2,000 apartment buildings for Jewish occupation, giving each of us about 5 square meters of space. And that meant really a very, very tight living conditions. We were to some extent lucky that an aunt and great aunt of mine were living together in a one-bedroom flat. And my mother and I could go and join them in that space. So we had one bedroom and bathroom and kitchen to the 4 of us. It was tight, but at least we weren't like some other people who had to go in and move and live with total strangers. The government also introduced constraints on shopping. Jews couldn't shop in Christian shops and vice versa. There was a general attempt, as we had moved into these yellow star houses, to grab Jewish property, both the buildings and the contents. And it was pretty miserable living. We were under curfew. We could only go out for 3 hours a day. And you can imagine if under those conditions you were unlucky enough not to have a doctor or a dentist in your house, you virtually you were left with no medical attention in 3 hours. You couldn't possibly go to a hospital for anything like that. And from this period, one of the saddest event that I can tell you about is that what we thought was a good break, my father managed to get a 3-day leave from his commanding officer, and he came home to stay with us, and it was great joy. But in every one of these apartment blocks, there was a concierge whose duty it was to check on the people who were in the building, and he was very concerned that we were exceeding the numbers. And he went and reported my father to what was now emerging as really the controlling force over and above the government, the Hungarian Fascist Party, what they called the Arrow Cross. And these people came around, notwithstanding my father's permit, they took him away. And I never saw him again. All I know is that by this time, because the Arrow Cross were not satisfied with the speed of deportations through the trains, what they used to do is that they would go and round up 100, 200, 300 people, march them to the River Danube, which goes through the middle of Budapest, and they would tie together 3 people, and after they stripped them naked and take them to the riverside, shoot the one in the middle who would fall in the river, dragging the other 2 with them. And sadly, I have to assume that that is exactly what happened to my father. And I was always wondering who who these people were, who from one day to the next, from civilized and normal individuals suddenly became like wild beasts. I could never understand it then, and I can't understand it now. The war moved to moved toward Budapest ever more rapidly, and the Russians were approaching from the east. This was in the autumn. The Allied troops landed by then in Normandy, which strangely enough we managed to find out about, because when we had the air raids, the British would be bombing at night, the Americans during the day, and we, during the air raids, would go into the basements of these buildings. But somebody managed to hide a radio set, and we would listen to the BBC's and Voice America's Hungarian language broadcasts. And so we were hoping that this would eventually bring us relief. It's a very strange feeling when you're being bombed and your life is in danger, and at the same time listening to the adult conversation as a child, you realize that the good guys are the ones who are in fact trying to kill you. But we lived on, more and more trouble under these circumstances, until my mother found out that they were now setting up a ghetto in a 1 square mile area of Budapest. And this really appeared as a serious threat to her. And not to mention the fact that they were starving and disease of all sorts in the ghetto. She also knew that that was the last step before deportations. So she made every effort to get us away from that possibility. And in fact, found out from an uncle of mine who was one of the Zionist leaders in the Jewish community, that some of the neutral embassies, the Swedes, the Swiss, the Spanish, had purchased some property where they put up their national emblems and flags, etc., and said this is protected property, and they offered it to those Jews who managed to contact them. And my mother found a place through my uncle's friends, and we moved in to 3 or 4 bedroom villa. Just imagine about 30, 40 of us in one place with 1 bathroom, 1 bedroom, very limited food, etc. And we were hoping that we would manage to survive there. And in the meantime, it's probably worth mentioning that the only kind of resistance that emerged at that point, that there were some young Zionists with my uncle who managed to produce some false documents showing that you were a citizen of another country, or that you were protected by the Red Cross and stuff like that. There were some notable people like Raoul Wallenberg and Karl Lutz who really led this kind of activity. But apart from that, there was no chance for any other resistance. And the other very significant fact that I can't even say it's I remember it, because it was my mother who told me about it well after the war in the 1960s. She obviously couldn't bring herself to mention it, that during this time she was rounded up on the street one day, and the Arrow Cross started marching her with a couple of hundred other women. By this time there were hardly other men around the place. And it occurred to her that if she she was taken away on maybe on the deportation trains to a camp or something like that. Not only was her life at risk, but also I was left in that house with a bunch of total strangers, no friend, no relative, and probably I would perish too. So, although there were 4 armed guards, she decided to make a run for it. And the guards tried to shoot her. And fortunately, these were untrained people, they kept missing. But what she told me in her story was that as she turned around to see what was going on behind her, to her utter amazement, she found that not one of the other 200 followed her example, and probably a half or 2/3 could have got away. But by this time, people were so much in the mental condition of just wanting to survive that nobody would want to take a risk. It was kind of as long as there's life, there is hope. So they were just frozen and wouldn't do anything even to save their life or get their liberty again. We managed to stay for another few weeks in this so-called protected house. And again, my mother began to sense that the Arrow Cross and the Germans may not respect the neutral flag very, very much longer. And through her father, she found out that Lutheran family, friends of my grandfather, might be prepared to hide us. And actually on Christmas Eve, she said to me, "We're leaving this place, pack a small bag for herself, and I got a little backpack with the absolute minimal belongings." And she took the yellow star off our overcoats, got on a tram. She told me in advance, if anybody stops us, we must not say we're Jewish, we're just going to join family for Christmas Eve celebrations. Unfortunately, nobody stopped us, and we got to the place where we had the address. They were total strangers to us, but they very kindly hid us in their cellar. We would only be allowed to come up in the evenings with the shutters closed on the windows, because they were afraid of their own neighbors reporting on us. And we were on the side of town, again, very fortunately, from which the Russians were approaching. And by the second week of January, we were actually liberated. And we could hear the gunfire. We knew there were street fightings in the rest of the town. And eventually the news came that there were no more German troops in Hungary, and it was possibly safe to go back to our home. And my mother was very keen to find out what happened to the rest of the family. We had to walk. There was no transport. We had to walk to the river, because we were on one side of the Danube and our home on the other side. When we got there, we found that all the bridges had been blown up by the Germans, but we managed to get across in a small boat. And when we met in particular, my grandmother, we then began to get the news about events in the family. And it turned out that of my mother's family, something like 2/3 perished. In fact, no man was left alive. And of my father's siblings, he was one of 6. There were only 2 who survived. And really, this is more or less the end of the story. We would go almost every day, my mother and I, to the Central Synagogue, which became a kind of gathering place for Jewish people looking for news about survivors. And some people would come back from the camps or from the labor units and just stick up a notice saying who they have seen dead or alive. And eventually we just had to conclude. My mother kept hoping that perhaps somebody would bring news about my father, but it just never happened. And we just had to accept that. And that's how my story ends.
My name is Rema Mugueneza. I am a survivor of the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi. I am based in Manchester, and I'm also one of Ishami Foundation Survivor Speaker. As we mark the Holocaust Memorial Day today, I would like to highlight how even in the darkness moment, one can find a light, as my own rescuer was the light in my darkness. 26 years on, I'm pleased to say that my home country, Rwanda, there is more light than darkness, as many Rwandans have embraced a path of reconciliation that allowed survivors and perpetrators to live together once again. Great progress has been made since the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi, as today, Rwanda is one of the safest countries, and remarkably, now makes up to 61% of the women in the parliament, the highest in the world. Today, the lessons of Rwanda are truly a great example of how we can all aim to be a light in the darkness. I would like now to share my own story. As we took the road to our escape, the rain was pouring. We were passing roadblocks where people were being killed, tortured, killed, and I'm wondering, will I make it? Terrified, I closed my eyes, and before I knew it, we reached one of the petrol stations. I'm looking through my black scarf, which I used to hide my identity, trying to work out what is going on. Then I heard a voice calling, "Is that you?" Here was my savior, Gatinzi, in his military uniform, wondering if I was really who he thought I was. With my fearful voice, I said, "Yes, it's me." He offered me a safe place in his pickup, which made me a bit relieved, as I didn't know what to expect. Despite the surroundings, the mountain looked taller than Kilimanjaro, and I could not stop thinking, what if this is my end? He protected me all the way to Butare, even at times pretending to be my relatives. As we reached my destination, he looked at me and said, "I will let them that you reached safely." For a few days, it seems like I had found heaven on earth before taking the road again. Crossing the Akanyaru border seemed impossible as we were surrounded by death. Crying, traumatized, as we were put in line, I had bullets over my head with screaming voice yelling, "Cross quickly." Then I started running until I couldn't run no more. I am now standing on the other side of the border, shaking, unresponsive, wondering how it all happened. With my hands in the air, I thanked Allah for my lucky escape and prayed for my family's safety too. Within my story, my savior was the light in the darkness, and it is my responsibility to share it to the next generation as it holds a lesson for us all. We all must stay vigilant against discrimination, hatred, and identity-based hostilities. If we all stand together in solidarity, we all can choose to be the light in the darkness in the varieties of ways and places, such as at home, in public, and online. Together, we can be the light in the darkness. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Shekinah Wilberforce, and I'm the Greater Manchester Youth Combined Authorities Inclusivity Lead. This poem is called That is the Last Solitary Coach, and it was written by David Vogel. That is the last solitary coach, and it's about to leave. Let us get in and go, for it won't wait. I've seen young girls going softly, with sad faces that looked ashamed and sorry, like purple sunsets, and chubby pink children who went simply because they were called. I've seen men who've stepped proud and straight through the world's streets, whose eyes went ranging far and wide. They too got in calmly and left. And we are the last. Day is declining. The last solitary coach is about to leave. Let us too get in quietly and go, for it won't wait.
This is the testimony of Hansu Mala, a Rohingya Muslim from Myanmar. She grew up in Tula Toli, where the Burmese military committed a massacre in 2017. Hansu and her family escaped to a refugee camp in Bangladesh. The treatment of us Muslims was getting gradually worse and worse. In August 2017, the military were closely guarding and watching our village for no reason. Every few days, they would round all of us up. They would choose people at random, claiming they were suspicious characters. They would beat some, throw some into jail. We were living in fear. Whenever we would hear that the military is coming, everyone would be afraid and hide in the hills. If they saw a pretty girl, they would go after her and rape her. We witnessed how they beat, cut, and slaughtered all the innocent people. They made the Rohingya people dig their own graves. All the able-bodied men were told to dig the holes. In that hole, they threw all the bodies. They poured gasoline into the hole all over the bodies and set it ablaze. We saw everything they were doing. They have killed so many of us. Can you imagine how we feel?
First they came for the communists, and I did not speak out, because I was not a communist.
Then they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out, because I am not a socialist.
Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out, because I was not a trade unionist.
Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out, because I am not a Jew.
Then they came for me.
And there was no one left to speak out for me.
A prayer for Holocaust Memorial Day 2021. Loving God, we come to you with heavy hearts, remembering the 6 million Jewish souls murdered during the Holocaust. In the horrors of that history, when so many groups were targeted because of their identity, and in genocides which followed, we recognize destructive prejudices that drive people apart. Forgive us when we give space to fear, negativity, and hatred of others, simply because they are different from us. In the light of God, we see everyone as equally precious manifestations of the divine, and can know the courage to face the darkness. Through our prayers and actions, help us to stand together with those who are suffering, so that light may banish all darkness, love will prevail over hate, and good will triumph over evil. Amen.
Shochein b'meromim Ametzoim nuchanechana Ahar kanfei hashechina B'malachas kedashim hotarim kezavarakia Megirinu masirim Heseni הקדושים הטהורים שהומסו ושנחרגו ושנשחטו ושנשרפו ושנטבעו ושנחנקו על קידוש השם באושוויץ Bergen-Belsen, Buchenwald, Treblinka, Meidenek, ובכל שיום מחנות השמדה, בעבור, שיאנו מספרים ללוי נשמוסם, בגן עדן, תהי מנוחסם, לכן ברחמים, יסירי מסי סכנביו לעלמים, ויצרר החיים את נשמותיהם, אדוני הנחלו אותם, וינוחו בשלום על משכבותיהם, ונאמר Amen.
Now I'd like to invite everyone at home to prepare your candles for lighting. We have with us a number of special guests. I'd like to invite them also to now begin lighting your candles. If everyone at home would like to join us as well, together we will light candles in memory of all those that perished in the Holocaust and in its subsequent genocides. In Judaism, candles are a particularly important memorial element. The verse says in Proverbs that the candle of God is the soul of man. Today we light candles to remember our duty, to fill the void that was left by all of those lost souls. Please join me now in a minute of silence as we contemplate all that we have heard this morning and as we resolve to be a light in the darkness. Thank you. A number of years ago, I had the privilege of listening to a rabbi in New York, his name is Rabbi Schneer, who described his experiences as a young child in Austria, the Kristallnacht, the night when synagogues across Germany and Austria were attacked, were pillaged, were destroyed. He described walking to school in the morning and seeing that the representatives of authority were in the streets. The police were in the streets, the fire brigade were in the streets. But the police weren't helping the victims of the violence. They were joining in with the violence. The fire brigade weren't putting out the burning synagogues. They were dousing the flames in the buildings next door. When he saw that evil had spread even to the leadership of the community, he knew then that all was truly lost for the Jews in his country. We live in a most wonderful country. And the fact that we are engaging in this Holocaust memorial together with the mayors of Greater Manchester demonstrates just what a wonderful country we live in, and that together we will succeed in lighting up the darkness. I'd like to invite the Greater Manchester mayors to please read the Holocaust Memorial Day commitment.
We recognise that the Holocaust shook the foundations of modern civilization. Its unprecedented character and horror will always hold universal meaning.
We believe the Holocaust must have a permanent place in our nation's and communities' collective history.
We honour the survivors still with us and reaffirm our shared goals of mutual understanding and justice.
We must make sure that future generations understand the causes of the Holocaust and reflect upon its consequences. We vow to remember the victims of Nazi persecution and of all genocides.
We value the sacrifices of those who have risked their lives to protect or rescue victims as a touchstone of the human capacity for good in the face of evil.
We recognise that humanity is still scarred by the belief that race, religion, disability or sexuality makes some people's lives worth less than others.
Genocide, anti-Semitism, racism, xenophobia and discrimination still continue. We have a shared responsibility to fight these evils.
We pledge to strengthen our efforts to promote education and research about the Holocaust and other genocides. We will do our utmost to make sure that the lessons of such events are fully learnt.
We will continue to encourage Holocaust remembrance by organising an activity to commemorate Holocaust Memorial Day.
We condemn the evils of prejudice, discrimination and racism. We value a free, respectful and democratic society.
I am Warren Smith, and I am Her Majesty's Lord Lieutenant, her personal representative here in Greater Manchester. Thank you for joining us here today. I hope you found the service as moving and as powerful as I have. I personally would like to take the opportunity of thanking the Mayor of Greater Manchester and the 10 councils of Greater Manchester for bringing us all here together to commemorate the Holocaust and genocide in places like Bosnia, Cambodia, Darfur, Rwanda, and many more throughout the 20th century, some of which continue into this century. I'd also like to express sincere thanks to everyone who has spoken today, and specifically mention Tommy for sharing his personal experience of the Holocaust, and to Rima for sharing her experience of the genocide in Rwanda. These personal and live testimonies are absolutely vital in an era where from time to time people speak out about denial. Understanding the atrocity of genocide is difficult for all of us. I've been attending Holocaust services now for over 10 years. And I'm so shocked and appalled about what I've heard, and have continued to research the genocide history of the last 100 years. Apart from the denials, another fact is that many nations stand back whilst these atrocities are happening. For instance, the Jewish Holocaust did not start in 1939. It started in the early 1920s, as the Jewish community was isolated, attacked, and totally dehumanized. We only went to war when Germany invaded Poland in 1939. Who did anything in 1932, when the Holodomor, perpetuated by Stalin, starved millions of people to death in the Ukraine? However, there is some consolation that Greater Manchester has a remarkable track record of compassion and protecting those who have suffered such atrocities. The Armenian community, which was being annihilated by the Turks, came to Manchester and built their first church in the United Kingdom in this safe city. The people of Chios, one of the Greek islands, were being massacred, and they too came and opened the first Greek Orthodox cathedral here in Manchester. In the 1930s, the Ukrainians came to Manchester, and today we have a vibrant Ukrainian community here in the northwest. In the early 20th century, the Jewish community started to come from different parts of Europe, and the numbers escalated from Germany during the 1920s and 1930s. I'm proud to say, back in the 18th century, when the French were massacring the Huguenots, Greater Manchester welcomed them. They settled in Newton Heath, bringing their cotton skills with them. And who knows, if we hadn't welcomed them, would there have been a textile industry and an industrial revolution here in Manchester? There is a lesson for all of us to learn. Whilst nations may not necessarily protect citizens of other countries from harsh atrocities, in towns and cities throughout the United Kingdom, we can welcome refugees and celebrate people of other nations and of other faiths. They, in turn, will help us build richer and more culturally diverse communities. Holocaust Memorial Day presents an opportunity for people of all backgrounds to come together, to learn from the past and to create a better future. It serves as a reminder that we all have a responsibility to resist hatred, to be the light in the darkness. A message I hope will stay with you long after this event. Personally, I would like to see a light somewhere in Manchester lit 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, guiding people to this remarkable city that has zero tolerance for prejudice and bigotry. It respects faith and respects culture. Finally, I'd like to end today's ceremony by sharing the words of Holocaust survivor Gina Turville, MBE, who sadly passed away in 2018. And I quote, "We would continue to do our bit for as long as we can, securing the knowledge that others will continue to light a candle long after us." Thank you for being here today.